And let's stay with the reactions. Joining us now is Rita Bahuguna Joshi of the Congress Party, also with us Pavan Verma of the JDU. Ms. Bahuguna, let me start by asking you, we understand now that your party leader Sonia Gandhi, along with the former Prime Minister Mr. Manmohan Singh, have arrived at 7 Racecourse Road in an effort to try and build bridges with the government as far as the GST bill is concerned. Given the fact that the Prime Minister has now decided to intervene in this matter, you heard his speech in Parliament today, a much more conciliatory approach being taken by the government. Is there hope that the GST bill is likely to go through?
Well, you see, the GST bill was the brainchild of the Congress Party, and it was being initiated by us for a far-reaching economic reform in the country. And for 2.5, 3 years, the BJP stalled it. And you could very clearly read the comments and the speeches of Mr. Jaitley regarding that in the BJP. Having said that, we are always open and we want the economy to move on. And as you just Rahulji has told you, there are 3 fundamental issues which need to be addressed by this government. And if the Prime Minister has spoken to the parties earlier, things could have been resolved. So now the ball is in the court of the government. They have invited the Congress Party leadership. They are there. Mrs. Gandhi is there. Dr. Manmohan Singh is there. And certainly, if they agree with the amendments that we want in the bill, we will go with them. But you see, we will not hasten into any decisions.
Okay, you're saying that you will not hasten into any decision. But let me ask you this, Ms. Joshi, because I asked this question to the former Finance Minister, Mr. Chidambaram, as well, and he said that there is no question of bargaining. We're not in a bazaar and we cannot bargain. Is it all or nothing, or is the Congress Party willing to give up on some of its demands if the government were to meet you halfway?
No, there's no halfway or full way. They should convince us that what we are requesting for is not in public good. It's not in the good for the economy. Either they convince us that what we are saying is not right, or we convince them what they think in the bill is not right. I think what is right for the people, right for the economy, should be clear. And I'm very hopeful that in this discussion something concrete will come out, because the Congress Party wants the GST.
The Congress Party wants the GST, and your hope... if you could just hold on, Ms. Bahuguna Joshi, I'll come back to you in just a second. Let me bring in Mr. Pavan Verma into the conversation as well. Mr. Verma, appreciate you joining us. Well, you have no problem with the bill because the JDU has supported the GST bill along with all other regional parties, whether it's the NCP or the Trinamool Congress. Do you believe that the note of conciliation that has been struck by the Prime Minister in Parliament today is likely to ensure the passage of the bill?
Well, we are happy that the Prime Minister is reaching out. But all I can say is that this exercise should have begun earlier. In fact, that has been one of our concerns, that the primary responsibility of running the House and the passage of bill lies with the Treasury benches. And we have seen in the past that there is no attempt to engage the opposition in a structured manner, to reach out, to seek a solution, to find a consensus, to engage, to discuss and debate. And so it becomes my way or your highway, and that is not the right approach for Parliament to run. So the Prime Minister today, one of his more conciliatory speeches, which of course raises many other questions, but I'm not going into that. If he has opened out to the Congress Party to discuss how the GST bill can be passed, I'm happy for that, but we still believe this initiative should have been taken earlier. And I believe that now that he has made this opening, there should also be flexibility on the part of the Treasury benches. An intention to discuss this seriously with a desire to find a solution.
Okay. All right, so what has happened in the past has happened in the past. You can accuse the government of not having been sincere in its efforts to try and get the opposition on board. Let me also bring in Nalin Kohli of the BJP, spokesperson for the BJP. He also joins us here on CNBC TV 18. Mr. Kohli, you've heard what Rita Bahuguna Joshi of the Congress Party has had to say, and you've also heard what Pavan Verma of the JDU has to say. And Mr. Kohli, you talk to any leader from regional parties or from the Congress Party, and the consensus seems to be that while the government talks about conciliation, the government talks about reaching out, up until now, the efforts have not been sincere. Has the government finally realized that it needs to be a lot more adept in political management to be able to ensure the passage of crucial bills in Parliament?
Well, I have not had the benefit of hearing what Ms. Joshi said because I've joined the program later, but I've heard what Pawan Bhai has spoken. Couple of things that while the opposition would like to put out their point of view, I think barring the monsoon session, where particularly the Rajya Sabha was locked jam, work did happen in the Lok Sabha. And preceding that, the sessions that we've seen, they have been fairly outstanding parliament sessions where a lot of work is transacted and the credit goes to Parliament collectively, which means not only the Treasury but also the opposition. So bills have been passed. One session has been a sort of a washout. One may have various angles to it, whether it should have been or not, who's to blame, but that doesn't really take us anywhere further. What's important is that at the end of the day, it's to the wisdom of Parliament and those who constitute this current Parliament to decide how they would like to see various policies take shape where legislative intervention is required, like the GST. And when the Prime Minister and the government have reached out, just a final comment. When the Prime Minister, when the Prime Minister and the government have reached out and that process is on, we should be optimistic and we should believe that there will be a collective wisdom on everyone's part to see that we find solutions in the interest of the country.
Oh, absolutely. And the reason why people have a lot more hope this time around is because of the intervention from the Prime Minister. But Mr. Kohli, let me ask you this. Why did the Prime Minister feel the need to intervene at this point in time? I ask you this because there seems to be, coming in from the opposition camp, voices that suggested that the Finance Minister had taken on a very confrontational approach on the eve of the Parliament session, calling the demands of the Congress Party preposterous. Did that finally force the Prime Minister to intervene to ensure the passage of the most ambitious indirect tax reform this country is waiting for?
I wouldn't assess it like that. Anyone else is in their rights to assess it as they like. It's not about, if there is a process of consultation on, and if the Prime Minister himself is also leading that, that has to be viewed keeping also in mind that it does not mean it is negating anything else, like what the Finance Minister said. Certainly not that. Because this is one government. This is not a coalition within a government. The Government of India is a single entity under Prime Minister Modi, and collectively, the benefit, the credit or the blame will go to the government. Secondly, it does not even mean that people, senior like Mr. Jaitley and others, do not have a point of view and they are entitled not to speak. Just as, even while this process of consultation is on, today, Mr. Rahul Gandhi had comments to make about what was his assessment why this meeting was taking place. Now that one way of looking at it is that's combative. The other way of looking at it is he's entitled to have a point of view. So I think we needn't see everything in this perspective.
Okay. Before I go back to Ms. Rita Bahuguna Joshi, Mr. Kohli, a final word from you. Are we likely to see a meeting of minds as far as some of the Congress demands are concerned? And some, by the way, are legitimate demands if you go by industry reactions. And even within the government, what we are given to understand from our sources is that things like the 1% manufacturing tax, even the government itself believes is a bad idea. But it was put on board to try and bring state governments on board. Could there be a rethink on some of the demands made by the Congress Party to try and get them on board?
I would not like to venture to make a comment on that for the simple reason. When Parliament is in session, then the collective wisdom of Parliament will start taking action. And everything is legitimate, which is on the table to be discussed. There is nothing illegitimate because there will be proposals, counter-proposals. It's in the nature of how acts or bills are passed. Even when a bill may be in an agreed format, there still, before voting, can be interventions and amendments till it becomes a final act. That does not mean that the bill which came in its form had flaws in it. It means that, yes, there was a consultation process, and then Parliament collectively, because the voting reflects that, decided that it has to be in this final shape. So I would not use words like legitimate or otherwise. Anything can be on the table in that sense. What has to be done is finally what is collectively decided, and Parliament is that forum where it finally gets decided.
May I make a request to him?
Yes, Mr. Verma, go ahead.
I want to make a request through Nalin Kohli to his party that while such negotiations are on and serious business has the hope of fructifying in Parliament, please try and keep in check the likes of Sadhvi Niranjan Jyoti, Sakshi Maharaj, Yogi Adityanath, Sadhvi Prachi, and others who unnecessarily initiate the atmosphere and disrupt the possibility of constructive work.
May I also respond to that, Pawan? Is that A, Sadhvi Prachi does not speak for the BJP. I don't know why.
Sakshi Maharaj, Sadhvi
I'm just making a correction.
Yogi Adityanath.
Yes. May I just finish, Pawan? So I said Sadhvi Prachi does not speak for the BJP. The others are members of the BJP. One is a minister too. There have been instances where people may not have agreed with them, but my training as an advocate has taught me that if Article 19(1)(a), which is under the Constitution, freedom of expression and speech, applies to you and me, it cannot not apply to someone else, even if we don't agree with their views. So I think at the end of the day, we have to differentiate between that. If the government were to have a policy like that, if the government had a view about it, then it becomes a different issue. But we will hope that we all are now, since past elections passed a lot, we all know that Parliament is in session. I'm not in Parliament, but all the likes, as eminent as you all, would probably now focus at what's the importance for the nation.
I'm glad that we could get a dialogue going between Nalin Kohli and Pawan Verma here on CNBC TV.
I don't think this is the first time, Shireen. There has been a dialogue between Pawan and me on channels.
I'm saying a civilized dialogue on television. That's hard to find these days, sir.
It's always personalized, in fact, between us. You're being unfair to both of us.
Let me bring back Rita Bahuguna Joshi into this conversation. Ma'am, you've heard what both Nalin Kohli and Pawan Kumar Verma have had to say. In fact, let me just quote back to you what Nalin Kohli says. Everything is legitimate. Anything can be on the table. Does this give you hope now that perhaps we could see a meeting of sorts as far as your demands are concerned to ensure the passage of the bill?
That's most important, Shireen. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
The second part is, and that has to be decided by Parliament.
By Parliament, absolutely. Yeah, Ms. Joshi.
Well, a short comment on Mr. Kohli's statement regarding their the right of freedom of speech of their MPs. The Prime Minister had also said today that along with the rights come duties. And the duty of the government and elected representative is to create an atmosphere of cordiality, of peace, and not make statements which will create disharmony in the society. Now, coming to this issue, I would like to say that the talks are on. We should wait for the outcome. The Congress Party has very clearly put its cards across. We have said that these are the objections that we have, these specific objections. Let's see how the government responds, because the government very well knew what the Congress Party, what objections we have. And obviously there are leaders over there, they will decide what to accept and what not to accept. And if Mr. Kohli is saying that it is the collective will of the House and they will decide. So I think the Prime Minister also said that it will be good if there is a consensus. And it isn't.
Yeah, it will be good that if there is a consensus, we hope that that consensus will be arrived at this evening at this meeting that the Prime Minister is hosting with the Congress leader Sonia Gandhi as well as the former Prime Minister Mr. Manmohan Singh. We've also got our tax expert standing by to take us through the implications of the demands being made by the Congress Party and what the GST and its final rollout could actually mean for the Indian economy. We'll get to them in just a bit. We are still waiting for images to come in from 7 Racecourse Road on that meeting. But let's bring in our tax experts as well for a quick comment as far as the GST bill and whether they feel hopeful today or not. Gentlemen, let me start by asking you, and let me start with the Deloitte view. What's your take? Do you feel hopeful today on the back of what you've heard from the Congress as well as the BJP?
Yeah, I think we are very, very hopeful that the GST bill will finally see the light of the day. And it seems very encouraging to hear that all points of view will be discussed and resolved. And GST is something which has been discussed for a long time now. And I think it's a reform whose time now has come.
It is a reform whose time has come. We've been waiting for over a decade now. But let me bring in Amit Kumar Sarkar, partner in direct tax at Grant Thornton as well. Mr. Kumar, thanks very much for joining us on CNBC TV 18. Let's start with the number one demand, and that is the rate itself. The Congress is demanding an 18% rate. The government has also veered away from the 25, 26, 27% kind of rates that the NIPFP had first put out, and the finance minister on CNBC TV 18 along with his officials has very categorically stated that a low and reasonable tax rate is the order of the day. 18% or perhaps even lower, would that really set the tone for the GST's successful rollout?
Well, that's the biggest demand really which India Inc. is also making. If you think about one of the fundamental promises of GST, it was to effectively bring down the indirect tax burden. GST is supposed to bring down cascading, but more importantly, GST is also supposed to bring down the median tax rate. Having said that, if you're looking at GST coming on board, and if you're looking at GST coming on board with 18%, the question that emerges is whether the government sources, their calculations respect 18% to be the applicable revenue neutral rate. A couple of days back, there was a bit of a news going around that maybe the range would be between 23 to 24%. I doubt.
No. Let me point that out to you. In fact, CNBC TV 18 has been reporting this for about a week and a half now, and we can say this with a fair degree of certainty that what we are given to understand from highly placed sources is that we could see a positive surprise on the rate, and it could be 18% if not lower.
Well, then that's the best news we can ever have right now. If you're talking about 18%, the fears of bringing in GST at a higher rate immediately goes away. Then what you have left is actually the technical structure of GST, which are the other demands of the Congress, the dispute resolution mechanism, the question of additional tax and so on. But yes, I can take that comfort, relying upon your sources, that if GST is going to be at 18% or lower, that is significant good news.
Sachin Menon, let's look at the other demand that the Congress is making, which is put the rate into the constitutional amendment bill, because there must be a cap as far as the rate itself is concerned, because governments are prone to playing around and tinkering. Now the Congress, the BJP or the government's argument is that that is a preposterous demand and you cannot actually include the rate into the bill, because if you need to change it for some exigency or the other, then you're required to go through the cumbersome process of Parliament. On that demand of the Congress party, where do you stand?
Well, I think this demand may not be even accepted by the Congress governments in various states, because it's in practice, such a demand is actually taking out the power of deciding the rate or taxing powers of the state governments to the central government. That is one. And second thing is, as you rightly said, once it is put in the constitution, then any increase or reduction in the rate for that matter, again, you have to come back for getting a two-third majority to amend the constitution again. And after a long time, we have a government with three-fourth majority, which was not a normal scenario. And I don't expect that would happen in the future as well. So perhaps dilute the intensity or the justification of this demand. And if we require, we can agree that 18% would be the rate. And, time will tell that whether that 18% would be a revenue neutral rate, or is it going to reduce the revenue potential of the government. And should that be less, then later they can increase the rate. Because the GST Council, as per the Constitutional Amendment Bill, has the power to decide increase or reduce the rate for that matter. I mean, to recommend the reduction of the rate for that matter.
Yeah.
So maybe from my perspective, that perhaps could be a demand which is unrealistic.
Okay, that's a demand that's unrealistic. Sachin Menon, on one of the other crucial demands of the Congress party, that is do away with the 1% manufacturing tax. And there they've actually got support from corporate India as well, because just about everyone seems to believe that that is a legitimate demand, because the 1% tax is inflationary. We understand that some quarters of the government also are amenable to a rethink as far as this particular issue is concerned, but states like Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, it may be difficult to try and push this through. The 1% manufacturing tax and its implications.
Well, this 1% tax is actually on interstate supply of goods. Now, this is, understandably, this is coming from those net exporting states who has a great stake in abolishing the CST. And therefore, this demand came up to say that for the next 2 years, this 1% on all interstate supplies should be allowed and should be a origin-based tax, and that should be retained by the manufacturing states without any provision for input credit. Now let us look at this today's scenario. Today's scenario, almost about the total interstate supply of goods, only about 15% is sold interstate. And
Okay.
that 15% is at the rate of 2% CST, which is mostly it is sold. And today the demand is that you allow us to levy 1% on 100%, which means that whatever may be the CST revenue which the states are collecting, the next 2 years, that revenue is multiplied by 6.5 times. Because only 15% you are charging now, it is going to be 15 into 6.5, which is 100. So this is a huge revenue potential, and in that case, the central government need not compensate at all. Not a single paisa go out of the pocket of central government to compensate the deficit in collection. Come that may, this create a great inconvenience to the entire GST architecture, because this is
Right.
promoting the cascading impact. And therefore, and not only that, even an interstate work contract or an interstate, what you call the job work scenarios, every time the goods going out and coming in, there will be 1% either side. And this is going to create havoc. This is one demand which I would definitely justify from the industry perspective, which Congress raised. It's
Okay.
a very valid point, and I'm sure that
Okay.
the whole of industry would support this demand.
Okay, and so you're saying that that is a legitimate demand as far as the Congress party is concerned. Mr. Mani, let me ask you this. We're still hopeful that it will go through in this session of Parliament, but then it will need to go through various state assemblies before it can finally be rolled out on the 1st of April 2016. Do you believe that the April 1, 2016 possibility is still real?
It would really be difficult for April 1, 2016 for GST to happen. And what I would like to say is that independent of the political processes that go with GST and the legislative processes that need to accompany all of those, trade and industry would need significant amount of time to get prepared for GST. Because GST is the largest reform, I would say not during the last decade, but it's the largest indirect tax reform that we have undertaken since independence. And sometime back when we were mentioning, in terms of whether the rate needs to be mentioned in the bill or not, one key aspect we need to bear in mind is none of the existing tax rates are mentioned in the Constitution. They are all part of the respective Finance Act of that particular year or levied by the state. So this is something which is very unique.
There is consensus. Yeah, I think on that issue there is consensus that is not really a legitimate demand of the Congress party of trying to incorporate the rate itself into the Constitution bill. I think there the Congress party doesn't really find support. Continue, Mr. Mani.
Yeah, and therefore I would just emphasize the fact that GST is going to change a lot of things for trade and business. It is going to change the manner in which companies go about planning for their procurements, the manner in which companies go about their pricing, the manner in which the information technology system work in various companies, and therefore trade and industry needs time to prepare for the most significant reforms since independence. And if you are looking at it towards the end of November, and even if the rules are made available in the public domain in December, 4 months is too short a period for trade and industry to prepare for it. They would need significantly much more time, because many of the actions that they need to take are not determined only by them. It depends on their vendors, it depends on their customers, it depends on their lawyers, it depends on the IT systems also.
You're absolutely right. So you're saying that the transition time is not going to be enough, and hence the possibility of an April 1, 2016 rollout, even if it makes it through the winter session of Parliament, is going to be a tough one. Gentlemen, hang in there. We are going to take a quick commercial break and return to this special conversation. The GST Tea Party is currently on in 7 Racecourse Road. All the action here on CNBC TV 18. For the first time since taking charge in May last year, Prime Minister Modi is breaking bread with Sonia Gandhi as we speak to win over the Congress party to ensure the passage of the Goods and Services Bill. Joining us from just outside the Prime Minister's residence, where the meeting is currently underway, is Pallavi Ghosh, our colleague. Pallavi, appreciate you joining us here. The Prime Minister is taking the first steps towards trying to get the Congress party on board, and his speech inside the Parliament today also very conciliatory.
It was certainly one of the most conciliatory speeches coming in from the Prime Minister, and very much like a statesperson. No politics over there. Certainly not speaking like a BJP leader, very much like what a Prime Minister should speak like, and as he himself said, like a member of Parliament. Making a reference to almost all the political leaders. He spoke about Nehru, he also spoke about Sonia Gandhi, he also spoke about the fact that how the national interest should be more important than one's own personal interest. Now, this is very interesting timing, because it also comes at a time when the Prime Minister and the government wants to reach out to the opposition, but specifically the Congress party, having called them for a cup of tea with Dr. Manmohan Singh and Sonia Gandhi. The Congress on board on GST is very, very crucial for the government if the GST bill has to become a reality. But how much is the government willing to bend? How much is it going to walk? Certainly it just shows by the Prime Minister's speech inside Lok Sabha that at least as far as the legislation is concerned, the government wants to bridge the gap which was there between the government and the opposition.
All right, Pallavi, we'll keep checking in with you as that meeting concludes. Joining us on the show, MS Money, Senior Director, Deloitte India, Amit Kumar Sarkar, Partner Indirect Tax at Grant Thornton, India, and Sachin Menon, Head of Indirect Tax at KPMG. Gentlemen, thanks very much for staying on with us. We are still waiting for clarity to emerge from that meeting. But let me ask you this, Sachin, and this is a statement made by the Finance Minister saying that it's better to not have a compromised GST being inflicted upon the Indian economy. In its current avatar, do you believe that this is a compromised GST?
Well, you never can have a perfect GST. I mean, I don't think that it has ever had any country which is having a similar structure as ours, a federal structure which is existing. So, end of the day, if we had a unified GST where the central government collect the taxes and distribute that among the state government, would have been an ideal scenario. It would have made the life much more easier for the taxpayers, for that matter. But in any case, given the constitutional provisions in the Indian Constitution, and that each of the state governments are very, very possessive about their sovereign powers to tax certain transactions.
Yes.
It is difficult to imagine that there can be a perfect GST in India. So this is a fact. We have to accept it.
All right, and those are pictures there coming in from the Prime Minister's residence. That's former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh being greeted by the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, and the former Prime Minister there sitting right next to Mr. Modi. Also in the presence of the Finance Minister Arun Jaitley, the Parliamentary Affairs Minister Venkaiah Naidu, and of course Congress leader Sonia Gandhi. That meeting currently underway, and these are the first pictures that we're getting in. But Mr. Money, let me ask you this, and let's talk about the global context now, since we are discussing the possibility of the rate being at about 18%. The global average, if I am correct, is about 16.5%. What would this mean in terms of India's competitiveness?
See, when it comes to the global average, what we have to bear in mind is a 16.5% global average that you mentioned. It's a number that has been arrived at by looking at various countries, many of which may not be comparable with India at all. So, for instance, we have countries like the UK, which have a 20% GST. And at the other end, we also have countries like Singapore, which have a 7% GST. Now, neither of these countries may be really comparable with India when it comes to the kind of businesses we have and the diversity of businesses that we have. So consequently, GST reform in whichever country it has happened has largely been a country-specific reform, keeping in mind the local realities of trade and business in that particular country. So therefore, when we look at India, to some extent, I would say that the global rates may not be too relevant. And what may be extremely relevant is the manner in which businesses are taxed today, and the rates that are therefore decided should be such that these do not have an inflationary impact on one side, and these rates promote growth and GDP growth on the other side. Now that would be the right rate for India as a whole.
Okay. Amit Kumar Sarkar, let's talk about both those points that Mani just raised. One is the inflationary impact of the GST in the interim, in the transition period as we transition to the GST, at least the first 2 years, and also then the impact as far as the benefits to the economy itself are concerned. You know, we've had this figure being bandied about very loosely, 1.5% to 2% will be added onto the GST if added onto the economy if the GST were to be rolled out. On both those points, if you can give your comments.
So, well, if you look at GST, first of all, we have to all appreciate that in India, a reform as radical as GST cannot be a point-of-time reform. It will always be a period-of-time reform because you cannot change something so complex and so far-reaching almost overnight. So this is a start. And what will be important is the series of amendments that will happen over the next few years after GST is introduced in whatever form. Admittedly, what India is currently proposing is a far diluted version of pure GST. But at least it's a start. On the other side, when you look at the impact on the economy, whether there will be inflation, there will not be inflation, it is also completely derived from the consumption mix. The normal, GST or the normal indirect tax burden on most manufactured goods is anywhere between 23 to 27%. If you're talking about GST at 18%, we immediately have a reduction in the indirect tax component of the total price of goods. Some part of that may possibly be trickled down into a price reduction in the hands of the consumer. On the other hand, services are today taxed at 14.5%. Obviously, the rate of GST on services will also probably be 18%, which means there will be an increase in the price of services. Now, look at people like you and me. What do we consume more? If we consume more goods, GST is good for us. If we consume more services, GST is bad for us. Extrapolate that into the economy. The economy is 50% contributed by services. 20% of that will probably be towards exports because you have IT, ITS and other services which are exported outside the country. Now do your calculations and see whether GST will be good or bad for the economy, keeping these percentages in mind. That's the theoretical promise. Effectively, looking at the consumption mix, both micro and macro, the view is that GST will hopefully bring the prices slightly lower. To what extent they will be lowered is obviously a question of a very complex set of calculations. And maybe that slight or whatever nominal reduction in prices will hopefully trigger consumption and therefore consumption-led growth, and therefore will also tomorrow trigger investment and investment-led growth, and which is what the committee reports are talking about as the engine behind the increase in GDP rate by 1.5 or 1 to 1.5%.
Okay. Sachin, just to take that point that Amit was making forward, and for the benefit of our viewers who are trying to understand the implications of the GST, so this is a GST 101, if I could call it that, on television. What would the implications be? Amit was talking about the services sector, but specifically as far as the manufacturing sector is concerned and for manufacturing states as well.
Well, see, the inflation which is caused by a tax increase is supposed to be a short-term inflation. It would settle down in a matter of a year or 2 years maximum. And that is what the experience say. So, and that is one of the reasons why Congress is trying to delay this so that BJP comes into an election year which would be the impact of this. If there is a negative impact, that will be reflected in that election year. So the point is that if you look at taking from the point which Amit said, that if you look at the 60% contribution coming from the service sector and the manufacturing sector contribution as of now is dropped down to almost about 16%.
Right.
So it is a reduction. So if you look at in a very simple way, the tax rate is going down from a 27% average for a standard goods to expected 20% for goods, which means that if that tax advantage is passed on to the consumer, every goods in India will go down by at least by 7%. That is the theory. Look at the service segment. The 60% of the GDP contribution coming from service, and maybe 50% of that is not taxed. Maybe it could be those exempted services. So 30% if you take it. On that, there is definitely going to be a price rise because it is going up from 14.5% to at least an 18% maybe. If that is the case, there is going to be an inflation in the service consumption. Now the question is that whether the government should unduly worried about such a inflationary tendency, because if you look at the Indian population, almost 80% of the population is under the the low income group or below. And what is their consumption as such for them to feel the pinch of GST increasing? The only thing I can think about is the mobile phone. Other than that, I don't think any taxable service this majority of Indian population uses. So the inflationary tendency may not even touch them. And whereas those mass consumption item is anyway going to be reduced. So I feel that the inflation may not be a big issue as far as the definitely not for manufacturing sector, even for service sector, because many of the services are input for manufacturing sector. So therefore, the inflationary theory perhaps may not be that severe as we think.
Okay, it may be overstated as a concern at this point in time,
That's
but
right.
let me start to get comments from each one of you in terms of the red flags that you're going to be watching out for. Let's assume, and this is of course something that we don't have clarity on at this point in time, but let's assume that the bill does go through in the winter session of Parliament. And Mani, let me start by asking you for your comments. It will then head to various state assemblies for the passage by various state assemblies. The GST network is being put in place as well. The Government and Economic Affairs Secretary right here on CNBC TV 18 stated that the administration is ready for the rollout. What would be the red flags that you would watch out for as we move towards the transition?
I would just say that the primary aspect that we need to watch out is the publication of the draft legislation, and that is something which the government has mentioned that it would be putting in public domain somewhere in first week of December. And once we have the draft legislation, which typically means the draft GST Act and the GST rules, once we have this, possibly we need to go through this in a lot of detail, because some of the discussion papers which have been put up on public domain have left a lot of matters which are of concern. So there is, for instance, a need for service providers to now obtain a registration in each state that they operate. So quite a few aspects such as these need to be looked at very carefully once we have the draft legislation in public domain. And this is something which is far ahead of the GST Constitution Amendment Bill moving to the state assemblies. That is something which in any case will happen as part of the process. But for trade and business as a whole, I think they should watch out for the draft legislation when it comes out very shortly.
Okay. Amit?
Well, I've been making this, enough number of times as a comment. First and foremost, we have this biggest hurdle to cross, which is the GST Constitution Amendment Bill has to be passed in the Parliament. Once it goes through the state assemblies, we will also need to, as Mani was rightfully mentioning, look at the detail, the technical papers, the draft laws and legislations. However, as a concept, there are some very key unanswered questions which we are hoping will see the light of day, and depending upon the answers, we would see it as an opportunity or as an issue. First point, how would you look at taxing intangibles? Would the government in the world of GST tax intangibles as goods or as services? If as goods, then what would be the place of supply rules for it? Some of our most critical sectors, software, media, entertainment, etc., are all based on intangibles. So they'll be watching this aspect quite closely. The second aspect is how would you now tax works contracts or bundled supplies? And the whole world of infrastructure, real estate and what have you are waiting with bated breath, because the biggest concern they have is segregating a common value, a mingled value, into a separate value assumed for supply of materials and supply of services. Now, how would you segregate that? Ideally, they would not want to segregate the values, because that would be an exercise of quite significant complexity between themselves and the revenue authorities. Last and final and most important conversation, which I don't know has come up quite that strongly as yet or not, is a very important part of economy, which is that the biggest consumer in any economy is always the government. And would the government be willing to tax itself? So when the government buys goods, when the government buys services, would they bite the bullet and accept themselves to be succumbing to the same provisions of GST as a normal consumer. If they do, that will give a lot of comfort and that will give a lot of clarity and will also effectively will be a direct incentive to the private sector to continue to come forward in all the public-private partnership areas. If you'll end up having government supplies becoming exempt, then that becomes a negative in the world of GST because all the input credits will be denied to the private sector. So these are the three areas as a concept that I would personally be watching out for more than anything else.
Well, thanks very much for comprehensively articulating those concerns, Amit and Mani. And the final word to you, Sachin.
Yeah. So the biggest concern is that as of now, the GST discussions and GST deliberations are behind the curtain. The industry had no visibility. There is no transparency of what was happening behind the curtain. Now, of late, the government started involving industry. So many of the drafts which they have been finalized by the subcommittees, etc., are actually to some extent on theoretical basis, because perhaps how is it going to be implemented by the industry and what are the issues surrounding that? Some of the provisions, some of those processes they put in place, they have not taken the feedback from the industry or taxpayers who's going to implement that finally. Now, for example, now they have talked about 5 return in a month for every taxpayer to file. And I had a situation where one of those government meetings, many of the traders done a walkout and made a lot of commotion. The fact of the case is that there is no 5 returns. It is actually some of the processes like uploading the purchase register, sales register, which you are even doing today. So that was communicated, or it is named as return, which is actually not a return in the real sense. So communication is very important. How you communicate to the public, to the industry, the stakeholders, what is GST all about, and that is perhaps very much lacking. That is one. Second thing is that once the GST draft law and rules are put out in the public domain, there will be a flurry of representations and concerns because, for example, now it is said that petroleum industry is outside the GST limit. The implication of petroleum industry not within GST is huge because almost many of the inputs which is used by the petroleum industry is going to attract GST, and there is no input credit in the petroleum sector because they are not in the GST. And this is actually going to increase the cost of fuel, cost of power, cost of energy, which is lapped up by every industry. So this is an indirect way of how inflation can catch up when you are introducing GST without understanding what is implication in each of the sector. So the biggest concern for me is that maybe that you go from a theoretical plateau to a realistic implementable solutions, which is ultimately require the feedback from the industry, and that has to be started as early as possible. And once that communication has gone well, because you have seen in Malaysia, people are agitating and protesting against GST on the streets. So unless and until we are careful in implementing, we will not be in a position to implement it.
You are absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Sachin, that process of communication needs to start, and perhaps we will see that process start once the CEA panel does submit its report to the Finance Minister, which we understand will happen in the first week of December, and there will be clarity then as far as the revenue neutral rate is concerned. But gentlemen, let's just hear out what the Finance Minister had to say about the Congress demand of including the GST rate in the Constitutional Amendment Bill. He called it flawed architecture. Let's take a look, and we'll be right back.
Almost over 50 years to make a suggestion of this kind, I think they'll probably have to revisit some of these suggestions. I have no difficulty in discussing with them, but the suggestions must never lead to a GST with a flawed architecture. Because a GST with a flawed architecture can actually damage the system much more than it can benefit. And once we are going in for such reforms, these reforms take place once in decades. And I would expect a party which for over half a century has been a ruling party in this country to seriously reconsider some of these suggestions. We are reaching out to them, we are willing to discuss with them, because some of these suggestions may not necessarily be in the larger interest of the GST structure itself.